Hey everyone, welcome back to day 5 of our watercolor week exercise practice. Today we are doing the wet on dry technique, which is super important and it's a lot of fun to do. So let's jump in and get started. Okay, so today we are working on our wet on dry technique and layering. So the first thing I want you to do is grab your loose watercolor wet on wet sky that you did last time in yesterday's video. Take that out and make sure it's completely dry. We're going to do a little bit of wet on dry using this as a background sky. So basically what wet on dry is that you are painting with wet paint on a dry surface, okay? It's not like wet on wet where you're painting on a wet surface. Now what this does is create really nice sharp lines. Unlike wet on wet, it was very blurry, kind of moved around, out of focus. This is going to create sharp, detailed lines. So I'm using my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook that I have here. I'm also going to show you in my Etcher Lab sketchbook that we did the other sky on that I showed you the other demonstration. And I have my Paul Rubens watercolors here. I have my Emma Lefebvre Craftimo brush right here. I'm going to use my size 6 for this. And I have my water and paper towel and I'm ready to go. Okay, so we have this sky like it's a sunset. Now we're just going to do a little landscape in front. I'm going to pretend because this is a sunset, the foreground is actually going to be black. Like we have that bright sky in the background, and then the foreground is going to be nice and dark. So I'm just going to grab some black from my palette. Okay, and I'm using my size 6 brush, and I'm just going to kind of create this uneven ground. So we're just doing a new layer on top. One thing you want to be aware of, papers like this Canson paper, sometimes if you scrub too hard, even if the background is dry, you might lift up some of that first layer underneath. So try and be gentle. And also when you're layering a new color on top, you want to make sure that it is darker than the color that you're layering on top of. So if I were to use like a yellow on top of this, it would totally change the color. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in our next exercise in this video when I talk a bit about layering and glazing. But you do want to be aware of what color you're layering on top. I'm using a black color, so black really covers anything. So it's not, you don't have to worry about it too much, but just keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to create like a little palm tree, I think, like a beach sunset, okay? I'm just going to do like a curved line for the tree. It's going to be a little bit thinner as we get to the top, like that. Just do a little circle here, and then I'm going to do these little palm leaves. I actually might grab my size 2 for this as well. I'm going to wash this off, and I'm going to grab my size 2 round brush. Make sure it's nice and wet. Because I'm doing some finer detail, I'm using a smaller brush. And I'm just going to do these little strokes. Trying to curve them gently. So this is a great way to practice your wet on wet, but also combined this wet on dry technique. So you can do 2 kind of practice exercises in one. Just always make sure that your background is dry first. Okay, if you're doing some wet on dry, you want some sharp detailed lines. You want to make sure that your background is 100% completely dry. Otherwise, you're going to get some of these marks that you're not going to intend or want to be there. Okay, so I'm just creating a little bit more. And there you go. That's honestly all there is to it for this. So you can do any kind of foreground little landscape piece. You could do buildings or anything. I'm going to show you in my Etcher sketchbook that we did the other sky on. Okay, so remember this demonstration here where I showed you I did those evergreen trees using the wet on wet technique to make them look like they're far away and blurry, right? Well, now I'm going to use the wet on dry technique to do some sharper ones that would appear in the foreground. So I'm just going to grab, let's do the Paynes gray. I have my size 6 brush again. I'm just actually going to bring it down just a little bit more. Try to get as much on my brush. I want to make it nice and dark. Okay. And I'm just going to, with my brush, actually I'm going to grab my size 2 for this. I'm just going to create some evergreen trees in the foreground. Now, if you're interested in learning more about how to create some trees, I do have a few videos on creating evergreen trees. But for this purpose, we're not going to do something super detailed. You can just do a vertical line and then just kind of go back and forth, dabbing across like so. Okay, you don't want it too symmetrical or too perfect. These are very loose. This is not a realistic landscape. And the reason why I did the line at the bottom here, I just wanted to bring it down just a bit more, just to make it a bit more dense at the bottom. You don't have to do that if you have enough space. And you're just doing this wet on dry, going across to create these sharp trees in the foreground. Okay, I'm trying to make them nice and dense at the bottom. And you can do some big ones, some small ones. I'm going fairly fast here. You don't need it to be perfect, but this is kind of the idea. So you have those ones that are blurry, far away from doing the wet on wet, and then you wait for it again to completely dry. You have to make sure it's dry before you continue. And then you can continue going on. Now, we also did some wet on dry and layering techniques with our first video when we were talking about, or not first, our second video on values, when we created that little mountainscape with the different values, right? We did our first layer of the sky, which was the lightest. Then we did a mountain, which was like the second lightest, and we just kept going, right? That's another form of layering. We were layering with one color, but I was still layering and using the wet on dry technique. We had to wait for the background to be completely dry before we continued. So that's just essentially what we are doing here. Just keep going all the way across, and you have this beautiful sunset with some trees. And there we go. Okay, so practice that. That's a lot of fun. That's how I use my wet on dry technique in a lot of my landscapes. And now I want you to do a fun exercise on layering and glazing. So glazing and layering essentially are the same thing, but when it comes to the word glazing, essentially what we mean is we lay down a color, a nice light wash of a color. We wait for it to completely dry. Then we add another layer on top with a different color, and it changes the color that's originally there. So I'm just going to show you an example with, let's try some yellow. Okay, and you can pick any shape. And we're just going to do a really fun kind of abstract piece, okay? Just pick some shapes. I'm picking these like ovals. Make them kind of lumpy. Like so. You know what? I might pick a different color. Let's pick some pink. And I'm just painting in my Etcher sketchbook still. You can try and do this with your cheaper paper, whatever you have. Okay, these ones are not touching. Okay. Now what I want you to do is I want you to wait for it to completely dry, 100% dry. Okay, now, and I'm just going to briefly explain, if you try and do this with your cheaper paper or more inexpensive paper, one issue you might run into is it may lift the color underneath. Okay, so I'm going to show you, we're going to be layering some shapes on top when they're dry. If you press too hard, I'm just going to show you really quickly. Like if let's say I take a blue, okay, and I try and layer another piece on top, that's fine. But if you keep going over it, depending on the paper you're using, you might end up lifting the color underneath. So just be aware, try not to ever scrub so hard, because watercolor can be reactivated. You can actually lift color that's already dried sometimes, especially depending on your paper or paint. So just keep that in mind when we do this exercise. So just try and be gentle. Okay, so I'm gonna let these shapes completely dry and then I'll come right back. Okay, so my shapes are completely dry now. Now I'm gonna pick a new color and I'm gonna create shapes that are slightly overlapping some of these shapes, okay? So you're gonna see the original shape here, but then I'm gonna overlap like so. So the trick with glazing is making sure that that layer that you are adding on top is nice and transparent. You never want to do a darker value of that color where it's going to seem a bit more opaque. You want it nice and transparent so you can see the colors underneath. See there, it's changed it to a bit of a green, and on the pink area, it's changed it to a bit of a purple. So the purpose of doing that is to use a nice transparent wash as your second layer so you can see that first layer underneath. So that's kind of the difference between layering and glazing. Layering can be this because we're layering colors on top of other colors, but layering is also when you layer a darker color on top of previous colors, like we did with our first two landscapes. You weren't really able to see the colors we previously laid down underneath. We were just layering that dark color on top. It was nice and opaque, so we could get a really cool effect. But glazing specifically is when you're using a light wash, a transparent wash, so you can see those colors underneath. And this is really cool because it kind of looks like sea glass. Okay, so we're glazing by using that light wash and just overlapping like so. Then, actually, I'm going to do one more. Okay, and I'm not scrubbing with my brush. I'm being very gentle. We don't want to lift that color underneath. And I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll do another layer of different colors. Okay, so now that that's completely dry, we can add a new color. I'm going to try and go for like this Viridian green color. And I'm just going to, again, layering a new shape. It's also changing that original color underneath. Like so. And there you go. You have a really fun layered abstract kind of piece. Another really fun project to do with this layering technique is to create some see-through flowers. So I'm going to show you quickly what I mean, or transparent flowers. So you could do a flower petal like this. Doesn't have to be perfect at all. Then I'm going to do another one. And I actually have a tutorial doing these transparent flowers that you can watch. I will link it below. I'm gonna add one more. I'm gonna let that completely dry. Okay, so there we have our first color. Let's slightly change it. We can add a little bit of pink to our purple, just get a slightly different shade. And then we're gonna, again, with a light wash, we're not doing a dark value, we're gonna layer over top like that. And you get this really cool layering effect for a flower. And there you go. And then you can add a stem and all that, or a center, whatever you'd like. But that's a really fun exercise to do with glazing and layering as well. Now again, if you want to just practice different lines, try things with different brushes, you can do that just by creating lines. Okay, you can create a wash going across. The biggest thing is you just have to wait for things to dry. Now I'm going to share with you a little tip of something that I use daily with my paintings. One, because I am super impatient. I do a lot of painting and filming each day, and waiting for things to dry is just too much for me. So I actually purchased one of these heat tools that is used for embossing in crafts. You can get them for like $20 on Amazon. I got mine years ago from a different website. I don't know if they carry this one anymore. It doesn't really matter. They're all pretty much the same, but I use this to dry a lot of my work. It dries it really quickly. I know some people who use a hairdryer to dry their work. Now, the only problem I have run into with using a hairdryer for me personally is my hairdryers were always too powerful. So it would actually blow the paint across the page. But if you have an older hairdryer that is like, you can put on a really low setting, which is not too hot, but kind of hot, but the air setting where it doesn't blow it too hard, you could use that instead. But I use this all the time. So if that's something you want to invest into, I would look into that. I will link it below, but that's how I dry my work. And there's just a simple on off switch, and I'll just show you quickly. It just dries it. And there you go. It's nice and dry. Now you can add, a new color and just go right over top and just practice your layering. See how the glazing, it changes the color underneath. Like that. Super fun. And there you go. So that is our lesson today on layering and the wet on dry technique. Super important as well. So I suggest you practice lots, be creative with it, and have fun. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really hope you liked it, and I hope you guys learned something. Don't forget, if you have missed any of our previous videos from our watercolor week, they are all linked in the description below, and check back tomorrow for tomorrow's newest video, which we are doing one of my favorite things, color mixing and color theory. Don't be scared. I promise it's a lot more fun and not as boring as you may think it's going to be. It's going to be a good one, so make sure to check back tomorrow. I hope you all have a wonderful day and are enjoying this watercolor week journey with me, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.